The Midnight Express chugged steadily along the steel veins of the countryside, slicing through the pitch-black night. Its whistle echoed like a mournful cry, sending shivers down the spines of those waiting at the station platform. But for the passengers already aboard, it was a lullaby, a promise of movement, of escape, of a destination yet unknown. Inside the train, the atmosphere was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the bitter cold pressing against the windows. Lanterns flickered softly, casting golden pools of light over the plush seats and dark wood paneling. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks lulled many into a drowsy calm, their heads nodding with the gentle sway of the carriages. A man in a finely tailored suit settled into his seat, his eyes drooping as he skimmed a well-worn book. Across from him, an elderly woman clutched a small velvet box in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Nearby, a young couple whispered to each other, their hands entwined, sharing secrets and smiles as the train carried them through the night. For a while, everything seemed peaceful, ordinary even. But then the train lurched unexpectedly, and a strange hush fell over the passengers. The usual chatter faded into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the steady beat of the train's wheels. The fog outside thickened, swirling around the train like a living thing, obscuring the moonlight and plunging the night into a deeper darkness. The conductor moved down the aisle, his eyes darting nervously toward the windows as he reassured passengers that all was well, though his voice betrayed a hint of doubt. In the third car, a middle-aged man with a scar above his eyebrow looked up from his newspaper, frowning as the mist seemed to press against the glass, almost as if it were trying to get in. He folded the paper with deliberate care, setting it aside before rising to peer out the window. His breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, through the dense fog, he saw something, a flash of light, a distorted reflection, something that didn't belong. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the cold, impenetrable mist in its wake. Further down the train, in the dining car, a young woman stared at her reflection in the silverware, noticing a faint, ghostly figure standing just behind her. She whipped around, her heart pounding, but there was no one there, just empty seats and the dim, flickering lights. The conductor reappeared, moving with more haste now, his footsteps echoing louder than before. "All is well, folks. Just a little fog. Nothing to worry about," he announced, though his words seemed to lack conviction. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. In the back of the train, where the glow of the lanterns barely reached, a few travelers huddled together, whispering nervously about the legend of the Midnight Express. They spoke of a car that appeared without warning, one that wasn't listed on any manifest, and of passengers who boarded it, never to be seen again. "It's just an old ghost story," a woman with a trembling voice said, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. But the others were not so sure. As the fog pressed in closer, the sense of unease grew, creeping into the hearts of everyone on board. The train surged forward into the night, its destination uncertain, and as it did, an unseen presence seemed to awaken, its gaze fixed on the unsuspecting passengers. The Midnight Express was no ordinary train, and for those who had boarded it, the journey had only just begun. The Midnight Express barreled through the fog, its steel wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks. The fog, thick as soup, swallowed the world outside the train, leaving nothing visible but an oppressive grayness. Inside, the passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at their watches and out the windows, though there was nothing to see. As the train passed through a particularly dense patch of fog, the atmosphere inside began to change. It started subtly, A slight drop in temperature, the faintest whiff of something old and musty, like a forgotten attic. Passengers who had been dozing off suddenly found themselves wide awake, their senses tingling with an inexplicable unease. A young boy, no more than 7, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, his wide eyes reflecting the dim lights of the carriage. "There's a man back there. He looks funny." His mother, distracted and tired from the long journey, barely glanced up from her knitting. "Don't be silly, dear. There's no one back there. Now sit still." But the boy was insistent. "He's got funny clothes, like from Papa's old pictures." The mother sighed and finally looked up. She scanned the car, expecting to see the usual assortment of passengers. Instead, she saw something that made her blood run cold. At the far end of the carriage, just beyond the last row of seats, stood a man dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His eyes were hollow, and his face, though blurred by the fog seeping into the train, was unmistakably pale, almost translucent. She blinked, and the man was gone. The mother gasped, dropping her knitting needles to the floor. She stared at the empty spot where the figure had been, her heart hammering in her chest. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But the boy was now more interested in a toy train he had pulled from his pocket, oblivious to his mother's terror. She looked around, but no one else seemed to have noticed. Swallowing her fear, she pulled her son closer, trying to convince herself it had been a trick of the light. In the next car over, an elderly gentleman was reaching for his briefcase when he felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked up to see the door at the end of the car sliding open on its own. A cold draft swept through, bringing with it the sound of distant, ghostly whispers. He hesitated, his hand frozen on the handle of his briefcase, listening intently. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They were voices, desperate, pleading, and full of sorrow. The words were indistinct, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. The old man's breath quickened, and he hurriedly closed his briefcase, his mind racing. He had heard the rumors about the Midnight Express, but he had never believed them, until now. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire car, startling the passengers. A few muttered in annoyance, but most remained oblivious to the true cause of the disturbance. The elderly man, however, was shaken to his core. He knew what he had heard, and it was not of this world. As the train pushed onward, a sense of dread settled over the passengers. In the dining car, the young woman who had seen the ghostly reflection earlier now sat alone at a table, her uneaten meal cooling in front of her. She stared into her wine glass, watching the dark liquid ripple as the train swayed, when she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. Her hand flew to her throat, but when she turned, there was no one there, just the empty seat across from her. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The conductor appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, as if he had seen something unspeakable. He opened his mouth to make his usual round of announcements, but hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the back of the car. The passengers followed his gaze, and that's when they saw it. There, coupled to the last car, was a new addition, a train car that hadn't been there before. It was old, its windows dark and dusty, with curtains that seemed to move of their own accord. The train's rattling intensified as if the very presence of this new car was disturbing the Midnight Express. One by one, the passengers stood, craning their necks to get a better view. Whispers filled the air, growing in volume as the realization dawned on them all at once. This was the phantom car, the one spoken of in hushed tones and nervous laughter. But there was no laughter now, only fear. A brave, or perhaps foolish, young man stepped forward, his curiosity overpowering his sense of danger. He reached for the door handle to the mysterious car, but before his hand could make contact, the door slid open with a groan, revealing a dark interior lit by a faint, eerie glow. The passengers recoiled as a cold, damp wind blew from the car, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. From the depths of the car, a shadowy figure emerged, its form barely human, as if it were made of smoke and sorrow. It hovered at the threshold, and for a brief moment, its eyes, glowing with a dim, ghostly light, locked onto the passengers, filling them with a paralyzing terror. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure retreated back into the darkness, the door slamming shut behind it with a final, bone-chilling clang. The passengers stood frozen, their hearts pounding in unison, as the train continued its relentless journey into the unknown. No one dared speak, but the truth was clear. The phantom car was real, and whatever had entered the train with it was not of this world. The Midnight Express was no longer just a train. It was a vessel for something far more sinister. The Midnight Express rolled on, its wheels clicking a somber rhythm against the rails, a rhythm that now felt more like a heartbeat, one that grew weaker with every passing mile. The passengers remained huddled in their seats, the memory of the shadowy figure lingering like a cold breath on the back of their necks. No one dared to approach the phantom car again, but its presence weighed on them all, a dark, ominous cloud that hung over the train. In the first-class compartment, the elderly gentleman who had heard the ghostly whispers couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He pulled a yellowed newspaper from his briefcase, its edges frayed with age. It was a relic from decades past, the headlines barely legible, but the story it told was unforgettable. "Tragic train crash claims dozens," it read. The gentleman's eyes scanned the article, piecing together the fragments of a forgotten horror. It spoke of a horrific accident, a late-night collision that had sent a train plunging off a bridge into a ravine, its passengers trapped in a nightmare of fire and twisted metal. The Midnight Express, he realized with a chill, was traveling the same route. As the gentleman absorbed the details, the train's lights flickered, plunging the car into brief moments of darkness. With each flicker, the temperature seemed to drop, and the passengers could swear they heard faint cries, like echoes from a long-forgotten past. The elderly man's hands trembled as he read the names of the victims, his breath catching in his throat as he realized some of them matched the names on the current passenger list. Meanwhile, a small group of passengers, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, had gathered in the lounge car. Among them was the young woman who had felt the cold breath on her neck, the mother and her son, and the brave young man who had nearly stepped into the phantom car. They whispered in low, hurried tones, their eyes darting nervously to the windows as if expecting to see the ghostly figure reappear at any moment. "We need to know more about that car," the young man said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "If we understand what's happening, maybe we can stop it." The young woman nodded. "There has to be a reason it's here. Spirits don't just haunt trains for no reason." The mother clutched her son tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "What if it's here for us? What if we're next?" The young man shook his head. "No, it's not random. There's a connection. We just need to figure out what it is." The elderly gentleman, hearing their conversation, shuffled over, the newspaper clutched tightly in his hand. "I think I might have some answers," he said, his voice quivering with age and fear. He laid the newspaper on the table, pointing to the headline. "This crash happened 50 years ago, on a night just like this. The Midnight Express was on the same route." The group leaned in, their faces pale in the dim light, The gentleman continued. The train plunged off the old silver bridge, killing nearly everyone on board. But there were rumors. Stories about a car that wasn't on the original manifest. A car that appeared just before the crash. The phantom car, the young woman whispered, her voice barely audible. The gentleman nodded gravely. They say it was full of passengers who didn't belong. People who weren't on the passenger list, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like ghosts from another time. Some believe they were spirits from a previous crash, returning to claim new souls. The mother gasped, pulling her son closer. But why us? Why now? The gentleman shook his head. I don't know, but I believe the phantom car is trying to repeat the past. It's drawn to tragedy, to death. And if we don't do something, we might all end up like those poor souls 50 years ago. The young man stood up, determination flashing in his eyes. We need to stop this train. We need to get off before it's too late. But how? The young woman asked, her voice trembling. We're in the middle of nowhere, and that fog, it's not natural. It's like it's keeping us on the tracks. The gentleman's eyes narrowed as he considered their options. If we can't stop the train, then we need to confront the spirits directly. They're here for a reason. Something unfinished. Something they need. If we can find out what that is, maybe we can put them to rest. The mother looked horrified at the thought. You want us to go back to that car? To face those things? The gentleman nodded solemnly. It's the only way. We have to understand why they're here, or we'll be doomed to repeat their fate. The group fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. The train rattled on, the fog outside thickening, and the phantom car loomed at the back, its presence a dark, pulsating stain on their journey. Finally, the young man spoke, his voice firm. We'll go together. We'll figure this out. But we need to be prepared. Whatever's in that car, it's not going to let us go without a fight. With that, they made a plan to investigate the phantom car, to delve into the darkness and uncover the truth of the Midnight Express's tragic past. But as they prepared to face the spirits of the dead, a terrible fear gnawed at the edges of their minds. What if the phantom car wasn't just a ghostly remnant of a past tragedy, but a harbinger of their own impending doom? The train's lights flickered once more, and in the brief moment of darkness, the group felt a presence pass through the car, cold and unforgiving. The spirits of the phantom car were watching, waiting, and their journey into the unknown had only just begun. The Midnight Express continued its relentless journey through the night, the fog outside thickening into a suffocating blanket that obscured everything beyond the windows. The passengers could no longer see the landscape whizzing by, only the endless, swirling gray that seemed to pull them deeper into a world far removed from the one they knew. The group of passengers, now united by fear and determination, gathered at the threshold of the phantom car. The door separating the haunted car from the rest of the train loomed before them, its wood dark and ancient, as if it had aged decades in mere hours. The faintest trace of cold seeped from the edges, chilling the air around them. The young man who had taken the lead earlier reached for the door handle. His hand trembled slightly, but he steeled himself, refusing to back down. The others watched with bated breath as he turned the handle and slowly pushed the door open. A cold, musty breeze blew past them, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and something else. Something older, darker, like the smell of earth that had been undisturbed for centuries. The interior of the phantom car was dimly lit by flickering, ghostly lights that cast long, twisted shadows across the floor. The group stepped inside, their footsteps echoing ominously in the silence. The car's interior was a grotesque reflection of the rest of the train, with seats that looked as if they had once been luxurious, but were now rotting and covered in a thick layer of dust. The windows were clouded over, and the curtains hung in tatters, fluttering slightly as if stirred by an unseen hand. "Is it just me?" the young woman whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Or does it feel like we're not alone?" The elderly gentleman nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "The spirits are here. I can feel them. They're watching us." The mother clutched her son tightly, her knuckles white. The boy, usually so full of curiosity and energy, was eerily quiet, his wide eyes fixed on something only he could see. As they moved deeper into the car, the temperature dropped even further, their breath now visible in the cold air. The young man led the way, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he tried to make sense of the strange atmosphere. But as they continued forward, something unsettling began to happen. The train's familiar rhythm, the steady clattering of wheels on tracks, began to falter. The sound wavered, slowed, and then, to their horror, the entire car seemed to lurch. The group staggered, grabbing onto the decayed seats for balance as the world around them shifted. "What's happening?" the mother cried out, her voice rising in panic. The elderly gentleman's face went pale. We're not on the same track anymore." Indeed, as they looked around, the passengers realized that the phantom car no longer felt connected to the rest of the Midnight Express. The windows, once clouded, now revealed a landscape outside that was not the familiar countryside, but a twisted, nightmarish version of it. Trees gnarled and dead, the sky an oppressive blood-red hue. The tracks below were rusted, crumbling, as if they hadn't been used in decades. The young woman backed up against a seat, her heart racing. We've crossed over, haven't we? Into their world?" The elderly gentleman nodded grimly. "This is the past. We've been pulled into the moment of the crash." The realization hit them all at once. The phantom car had somehow dragged them into a time loop, forcing them to relive the final moments of the doomed train from 50 years ago. The fog outside wasn't just a barrier, it was a gateway, and they were trapped on the wrong side. As if to confirm their fears, the train's whistle echoed through the car, but it wasn't the familiar sound they had heard before. This whistle was distorted, drawn out, like a scream torn from the throat of something inhuman. The train lurched again, picking up speed, the rickety tracks groaning under the weight of its impossible journey. The boy, still silent, suddenly tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, pointing to the far end of the car. "Look." The group turned to see what the boy was pointing at and gasped in unison. At the far end of the phantom car, figures began to materialize. At first, they were nothing more than faint outlines, but as the train sped on, they grew more defined, their features grotesque and twisted by death. They wore clothing from decades past, their faces pale and hollow, eyes sunken and filled with sorrow. These were the spirits of the passengers who had died in the crash, forever bound to the phantom car. They moved slowly, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were puppets being controlled by an unseen force. They reached out with skeletal hands, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams, but no sound came from them, only the unbearable, suffocating silence of the dead. The young man stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. "We need to get out of here, now!" But as they turned to flee, the car door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The young woman rushed to the door, pulling frantically at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The spirits moved closer, their eyes locked onto the living with an intensity that spoke of deep, unresolved anguish. The train's whistle screamed again, louder this time, and the car shook violently. The elderly gentleman fell to his knees, clutching his head as if in pain. "They're making us relive it," he gasped. "They want us to feel what they felt, to experience their terror." The mother clutched her son, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to do something. We can't just stay here." But the group was paralyzed with fear, the spirits now only feet away, their twisted faces contorted in agony. The temperature plummeted further, frost creeping up the walls and across the windows. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of impending doom, as if the very fabric of time was collapsing around them. Just as the first spirit reached out to touch the young woman, the train hit a sharp curve, throwing everyone off balance. The young man was the first to regain his footing. He noticed something strange about the car, a small, flickering light at the far end, just past the spirits. It was faint, but it pulsed with a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the icy chill of the phantom car. "We have to get to that light," he shouted over the din, pointing towards it. "It's our only chance." The others looked at the light, then back at the approaching spirits. It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. Summoning every ounce of courage, the group began to push forward, moving through the narrow aisle, the spirits reaching for them with claw-like fingers. As they neared the light, the train's violent shaking intensified. The walls seemed to warp, the ceiling closing in, the air thick with the smell of burning metal and smoke. The spirits wailed soundlessly, their hollow eyes filled with despair as they watched the living pass by. Finally, they reached the source of the light, a small, glowing orb hovering just above the floor, flickering as if it were on the verge of extinguishing. The elderly gentleman, now fully aware of what it was, reached out with trembling hands. This is the moment they died. This light, it's the last fragment of their lives." The young man hesitated, unsure what to do. "How do we stop it?" The elderly gentleman closed his eyes, whispering a silent prayer. "We have to release them. They're trapped in this moment, forced to relive their deaths over and over. We need to let them go." He placed his hands on the orb, and for a moment everything stopped. The train, the spirits, even the cold, everything froze in time, suspended in the fragile glow of the light. Then, with a deep, sorrowful sigh, the orb pulsed once, twice, and then shattered into 1,000 tiny fragments of light. The spirits, their forms now softened, began to dissolve into the air, their expressions no longer twisted in agony but peaceful, as if they had finally found release. The walls of the phantom car shimmered and then faded away, the car itself vanishing into the night like a wisp of smoke. The passengers collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath as the train returned to its normal rhythm. The fog outside began to lift, revealing the familiar landscape of the countryside once more. The car door that had trapped them slid open easily, the warm light of the rest of the train beckoning them back to safety. They had survived, but the horror of what they had experienced would linger in their hearts forever. The Midnight Express was no ordinary train, and the phantom car was more than just a ghostly remnant of a tragic past. It was a doorway to another world, a world where time and death held no power, and where the living could become trapped in the endless loop of the dead. As the group stumbled back to their seats, exhausted and shaken, they couldn't help but glance back at the place where the phantom car had been, half expecting it to reappear. But the tracks behind them were empty, the night calm once more. Yet, as the train carried them closer to their destination, one thought remained. gnawing at the edges of their minds. What if the phantom car was not truly gone? What if, somewhere in the dark, it was waiting for another train, another group of unsuspecting passengers, to drag into its twisted loop of time and terror? The Midnight Express pressed on through the night, the memory of the phantom car now a shadow in the hearts of those who had seen it. And as the train's whistle echoed across the countryside, there was an unsettling feeling that their journey was far from over. The Midnight Express had returned to its normal rhythm, but the air inside the train remained thick with tension. The passengers who had faced the terror of the phantom car were huddled together, their eyes darting nervously to the windows and down the darkened aisles, as if expecting the spirits to reappear at any moment. Though the night outside was now clear, the fog had left an indelible mark on their souls. The elderly gentleman sat quietly in his seat, the weight of what they had experienced heavy on his shoulders. The young woman, who had been so full of energy and curiosity at the start of the journey, now stared blankly ahead, her hands trembling as she clutched a small locket around her neck. The mother held her son close, whispering soothing words that did little to calm her own frayed nerves. The young man who had led the charge into the phantom car paced restlessly down the aisle, his mind racing with the implications of what they had just faced. They had stopped the spirits from dragging them into the past, but something still felt wrong, unfinished. "We got out of there," the young woman finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was thin, barely above a whisper. "But did we really help them? Are they really at peace?" The elderly gentleman sighed, rubbing his temples as he thought. "We released them from that moment, yes. But spirits with such strong ties to the living world, they don't just disappear. There's something they wanted, something they were trying to communicate." The young man stopped pacing and turned to face the group. "They were trying to reach us. All those visions, the way the car pulled us into the past, it was like they were showing us something. Maybe there's something more we're supposed to do." The mother shook her head, fear flashing in her eyes. "We can't go back to that car. What if it traps us again? I can't risk my son's life." The elderly gentleman nodded in agreement. "No, we can't go back to the phantom car. But that doesn't mean we can ignore this. If those spirits are still out there, still tied to this train, we might not be safe yet. We need to understand what they want." The young man's face hardened with determination. "There has to be a reason they're still here. They showed us the crash, but there's more to the story. We need to dig deeper, find out who those passengers were, what they left behind." The young woman looked up, her expression thoughtful. "The orb. It was a memory, wasn't it? A fragment of their lives. Maybe they left something on the train, something important. If we find it, maybe we can give them what they need to finally move on." The mother hesitated, fear and exhaustion warring within her. But finally she nodded. "If it means protecting my son, I'll help. But we need to be careful." The group agreed to search the train for any clues, anything that might explain why the spirits were still tied to the Midnight Express. As they spread out, the train's atmosphere seemed to shift again, growing darker, more oppressive, as if the very walls were watching them, waiting. The young man and the elderly gentleman headed towards the front of the train, searching through the compartments that had once held first-class passengers. They rifled through old luggage, opened long-abandoned compartments, and examined every nook and cranny, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The young woman, meanwhile, took to the dining car, her eyes scanning the tables and cabinets for anything that seemed out of place. As she opened a dusty drawer, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out, a silver pocket watch, its surface tarnished with age. She held it up to the light, watching as the hands ticked forward, though the time was frozen at a few minutes past midnight. The mother and her son searched the rear compartments, moving carefully through the dim corridors. The boy, who had been unusually quiet since their encounter with the spirits, suddenly tugged at his mother's hand. "Mama," he whispered, pointing to a small door at the end of the hall. "There's something in there." The mother's heart raced as she approached the door. It was a small, unassuming storage closet, the kind used by the staff to store linens and supplies. But as she opened it, she felt a wave of cold air rush past her. Inside, among the neatly folded sheets, was a single faded photograph. She picked it up, her hands trembling. The photograph showed a young family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. They were standing on a platform beside a train, smiling brightly at the camera. The date on the back was from the year of the crash. The boy pointed to the little girl in the photograph. "She looks like the one I saw in the phantom car." The mother's breath caught in her throat. "You saw her? Are you sure?" The boy nodded solemnly. "She was with the other people. She was crying." The mother clutched the photograph to her chest, her mind racing. "We need to show this to the others." As the group reconvened, they laid out the items they had found: the pocket watch, the photograph, and an old train ticket the elderly gentleman had discovered tucked into the pages of a book. Each item seemed ordinary on its own, but together, they painted a picture of lives once lived, of passengers with hopes and dreams who had been lost in the tragic crash. "These belong to them," the elderly gentleman said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "These are the memories they left behind, the fragments of their lives that are still tied to this train." The young man held the pocket watch in his hand, feeling its cold weight. They didn't just want to be freed from that moment. They wanted to be remembered. These items, they're all that's left of them. The young woman looked at the photograph, her eyes welling with tears. They were just like us, ordinary people just trying to get to their destination. But they never made it. The mother gently placed the photograph on the table. "Maybe if we return these things to where they belong, the spirits will finally find peace." The group agreed to gather the items and place them in a small wooden box they found in one of the compartments. As they carefully placed each item inside, the train seemed to grow quieter, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. The young man took the box and, with the others following close behind, made his way to the rear of the train, to the place where the phantom car had once been attached. The door was closed now, but there was a sense of finality in the air, as if the train itself knew that this was the end of the journey. He hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and stepped out onto the small platform at the back of the train. The wind whipped around him, cold and biting, but he held the box tightly, determined to see this through. The others joined him, their faces pale but resolute. Together, they placed the box on the edge of the platform, and the young man spoke softly, his words carried away by the wind. "We remember you," he said, his voice steady. "We honor your lives, and we hope you can find peace now." With that, he pushed the box off the edge of the platform. It tumbled down, disappearing into the darkness below, lost to the night. For a moment, nothing happened. The train continued its journey, the night still and quiet. But then, just as they were about to turn back, the air around them began to warm. A soft, golden light filled the space where the phantom car had been, and for a brief moment, the group could see the faint outlines of the spirits, no longer twisted and tormented, but whole, at peace. They watched as the spirits slowly faded, their forms dissolving into the light. The train's whistle sounded once more, but this time, it was clear and strong, a sound of release, of freedom. The group stood in silence, watching as the light faded, leaving only the dark night behind. The Midnight Express had finally been freed from its haunted past, and the spirits of the phantom car were at rest. As they made their way back inside, the train's atmosphere had changed. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by a calm, peaceful stillness. The journey that had begun with fear and uncertainty was now coming to an end, but it was an end that brought closure and a sense of relief. The passengers settled into their seats, exhaustion finally catching up with them. The young man glanced out the window, watching as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. The night was over, and with it, the terror that had haunted the Midnight Express. But as the train approached its final destination, one question lingered in the back of their minds. Was this truly the end? Or would the phantom car return one day, drawn by unfinished business, by lives cut short, and by the memories that refused to fade? For now, at least, the train was quiet, its passengers safe. But in the quiet moments before sleep claimed them, they couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead in the endless tracks of time. The Midnight Express rolled onward, the first hints of dawn painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. The passengers who had survived the night's terror sat quietly in their seats, their minds heavy with the weight of what they had experienced. Though the spirit seemed to have been put to rest, a lingering sense of unease clung to the air, like a shadow that refused to lift. As the train approached its final destination, the conductor made his way through the cars, his face drawn and pale. He stopped briefly at each seat, offering reassuring words that felt more like hollow echoes than genuine comfort. When he reached the group who had faced the phantom car, he paused, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "You've all been through a great ordeal," he said, his voice low and weary. "But the journey is nearly over. We'll be arriving at the station soon. Once we stop, I suggest you disembark quickly and make your way home. It's best not to linger." The young man nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll be off as soon as we arrive. But is it really over? Will the spirits stay at rest?" The conductor hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window where the dark landscape rushed by. Spirits tied to such tragic events often have a way of returning, drawn back by the memories and emotions left behind. But you've given them something they didn't have before. Recognition, respect. That may be enough to keep them at peace. For now. The young woman looked up, her eyes tired but determined. "And what about the train? The Midnight Express, will it still run?" The conductor sighed, a deep, weary sound. "The train is more than just a machine. It's a vessel for memories, for history. As long as there are people who remember, who carry those memories, the train will continue to run. But the phantom car, that's another matter entirely. It may return one day if the right conditions arise. But for now, the tracks ahead are clear." With that, the conductor moved on, leaving the group to contemplate his words. They sat in silence, the weight of his message settling over them like a shroud. The train's rhythm was steady, almost soothing now, but the knowledge that the phantom car could return one day lingered in their minds. The mother clutched her son's hand, her thoughts a jumble of relief and lingering fear. She had faced unimaginable horrors, and yet they had survived. But as she looked down at her son, she couldn't shake the feeling that the experience had changed him, that the things he had seen, the spirits he had encountered, would stay with him forever. The elderly gentleman leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed as he tried to rest. But even in the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still see the faces of the lost passengers, their hollow eyes pleading for release. He had given them what he could, a chance to be remembered, to be honored, but he knew that some things, some tragedies, could never be fully resolved. The young woman glanced out the window, watching as the sky grew brighter, the stars fading into the light of day. She thought of the photograph they had found, of the little girl who had been trapped in the phantom car. She hoped that the girl had found peace, that her family, wherever they were, had been reunited in the afterlife. But a small part of her wondered, was there more they could have done? More they could have learned about the lives lost in that terrible crash? As the train rounded a final bend, the lights of the station came into view, a small, quiet place nestled in the countryside. The platform was empty, save for a single station master standing at attention, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes loud and jarring in the early morning stillness. The group exchanged glances, the reality of the journey's end sinking in. They had survived the night, but the memories of what they had seen, what they had felt, would stay with them long after they left the train. The Midnight Express finally came to a halt, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss. The station was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of arriving passengers replaced by an unsettling calm. The group gathered their belongings, moving slowly, as if reluctant to leave the relative safety of the train. As they stepped onto the platform, the station master nodded to them, his eyes flicking briefly to the dark windows of the train. "You've arrived safely," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "But I suggest you leave quickly. The morning light doesn't always keep the darkness at bay." The young man frowned, glancing back at the Midnight Express. "What do you mean?" The station master's gaze was inscrutable. "The station is a crossroads, a place where the past and the present meet. It's best not to linger too long, or you might find yourself caught between them." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The station master's words only deepened the sense of unease that had followed them from the train. Without another word, they hurried down the platform, away from the train that had carried them through the night. As they walked, the young woman paused, turning back to look at the Midnight Express one last time. The train sat still and silent, its dark windows reflecting the growing light of dawn. But as she watched, she thought she saw something move inside. Just a flicker, a shadow passing by one of the windows. Her heart skipped a beat, but when she blinked, the movement was gone, leaving only the empty train behind. Shaking off the feeling, she turned and hurried to catch up with the others. The station was just as the conductor had said. No place to linger. The sooner they left, the better. The group moved quickly through the station, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them. As they reached the exit, the young man stopped, turning to the others. "We made it through," he said, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. "But I don't think this is something we'll ever forget." The elderly gentleman nodded, his expression somber. "Some experiences change you forever. This was one of those." The mother squeezed her son's hand, her heart aching with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "We'll be all right," she said, more to herself than to the others. "We just need to move forward." They exited the station into the fresh morning air, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The world outside was calm, normal, a stark contrast to the nightmare they had just escaped. But as they walked away, the feeling that something had been left unfinished gnawed at the edges of their minds. The Midnight Express remained at the platform, its dark windows staring out into the dawn like unblinking eyes. The station master watched as the group departed, his expression unreadable. When they were gone, he turned back to the train, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something strange. There, coupled to the very end of the train, was a car that hadn't been there before. Its windows were dark, its wood weathered and old. The phantom car had returned, silent and foreboding, a ghostly reminder of the past that refused to stay buried. The station master took a deep breath, his gaze lingering on the car. He had seen many strange things in his time, but this was something different. With a final weary sigh, he turned away, leaving the train and its haunted car to the silence of the station. The group, now far down the road, felt a chill pass through them, though the morning was warm. They didn't look back, afraid of what they might see if they did. The phantom car was gone from their sight, but its presence, its memory, would stay with them forever. As they continued on their way, each step taking them further from the station, they couldn't shake the feeling that somehow they hadn't truly left the Midnight Express behind. The train and the spirits it carried would always be with them, lurking in the shadows of their memories, waiting for the right moment to return. For now, the journey was over, but the Midnight Express would run again, and when it did, the phantom car would be waiting, its passengers restless, its stories untold, and its final stop still just out of reach.